A virgin falls. There's a big blob on your nightie too, added Ben, pointing just below her chin. She couldn't see, so she raised her arms and quickly removed the soiled garment. She sat next to him and inspected the large wet patch. He could see her fresh white panties and he could also see the small wet patch over the opening of her thigh. Little cunt. Don't worry. It comes out in the wash, he said to reassure her that her favorite nightgown was not ruined. She threw it on the floor and sat back down with her legs crossed as before. Without invitation, Ben reached down and pressed his fingers against the wet patch on her panties. More juice was forced from between her flaps and the patch grew larger. You're wet too. Yeah, I felt it as I was sucking your cock. Ben continued to rub his sister's panties. Before long the flat section covering her pussy was saturated. Lay down. Dawn did what he asked. Ben had let her investigate his naked body. Dawn understood that Ben was going to do likewise. She moved herself up the bed and lay with her head on the pillow. She lay with her legs spread a little and her knees in the air. Ben kneeled between her legs and reached up to the sides of her panties. He grasped them with both hands and gently slid them from her legs. She lay naked before him with her young vaginal pussy spread wide. Her breasts were still quite small but her nipples were already prominent. He reached down and rubbed her pubic hair. It was just a soft fuzz and lay close to her body. Ben could see that his young sister had entered puberty, but that she had a long way to go. When was your last period? It just finished yesterday. Why? Oh, just wondering. He was wondering whether he could risk fucking her without a condom. He knew that if he fucked her once he would fuck her forever. He also knew that he would have to wear a condom each time. She was way too young for the pill. He resolved to make that decision later. Right now he just wanted to taste her hot wet cunt. He took her legs and bent her knees toward her chest. Her pussy rose to meet his lips as he bent toward her. He swept his tongue from ass to clit in one fluid motion. His tongue spread her flaps as it passed. When he drew his tongue within his mouth it was covered in a thick layer of juice from her small tight cunt. He looked up at her face and smiled. She saw his throat move as he swallowed the mouthful of juice. He returned to her pussy and set to work to arouse every part of her. His tongue danced from the mouth of her cunt, to her tight little anus and back up to her clit. Like her nipples, her clitoris was quite large and prominent for a girl so young. He took it between his lips and tickled the end with his tongue. She could not keep still. Her body writhed under him. After a time he dropped her legs and flopped onto the bed beside her. I want to have a closer look at these cute little tits of yours. She was about to protest at the use of the word little when it occurred to her that Ben had also used the word cute. She stifled her protest and thrust her chest just a little higher in a vain attempt at breast enhancement. Ben lay on his side and with his palm on her ribs, cradled one of her breasts between thumb and finger. Staying low, he squeezed a little, pushing her nipple higher. Her nipple became erect at his touch. You have gorgeous nipples, he remarked. Have you noticed that they are a lot like Mom's? You'll have really beautiful tits once they have grown a bit more. Dawn giggled gently, flattered by her brother's words. She had seen her mother's breasts many times and had always thought how beautiful they were. Ben reached behind her back and drew her chest toward his face. He was too high on the bed, so wriggled a little lower and reached for her breast with his open mouth. His mouth completely covered the small mound on her chest. He played with her nipple as he had played with her pussy a few minutes earlier. He slid his hand down to her ass and pulled her body close to his. The need in the human mind for symmetry is immense. Despite the attention her left breast was receiving, and possibly because of it, her right breast was screaming for the same. She threw her body back and pushed the neglected nipple toward his waiting mouth. As she did, her legs spread, exposing her dripping wet pussy. Ben rubbed his sister's pussy with the pads of his fingers, then brought his hand up and smeared her juice on the breast beneath his mouth. His mouth latched onto the shining wet tit as his hand returned to explore her juicy cunt. Ben was experienced with his hands. He had been exploring his mother's crack since he was 8, long before he could enter anyone with his cock. He played a little with her flaps and rubbed her large clit with his index finger. She writhed at his touch. Her juice had run down the crack of her ass, so he rolled his thumb across her anus to coat it fully. He repositioned his hand one last time and slowly thrust his thumb into her hot cunt. She felt him enter her. She had stuck her own fingers in her pussy many times, but this was different. She was not in control. Her brother's thumb was thicker and totally rigid, and it was sliding deep inside her. Once the second joint was touching the opening of her vagina, he paused. Dawn had gasped several times as Ben entered her and she took the chance to exhale. He felt her breath and when he judged that her lungs were empty he lunged again. The widest part of his thumb stretched the mouth of her pussy. She shrieked a little and panted a few quick breaths. He held his hand hard against the mouth of her pussy, probing the far reaches of her cunt with the tip of his thumb. He felt the hard dome of her cervix and the ribbed walls of her tight little hole. Before he withdrew he twisted his hand a little and settled his finger along the crack of her ass. Just when she thought she would burst, her brother pulled his thumb back a little and let her breathe again. He thrust again and withdrew, then again he was in her. She slowly settled into the rhythm of his dance. Every 6 or 7 strokes he would push hard into her and pause there. As he did, he would push or rub some other part of his hand against her. He would rub the knuckle of his finger against her anus, or squeeze her clit with his wrist. He felt her starting to reach climax. The walls of her cunt, which at first had slid against his thumb, began to balloon out and become rigid. Apart from the tight little opening, there was now a lot more room inside her. He could no longer reach her cervix. It had drawn away as her body tightened. He reached with his thumb and pushed against the distended walls of her cunt. He knew what he must do to bring her to orgasm. He leaned over her heaving chest and latched onto her tit with his mouth. Her nipple felt huge. He sucked hard and gnawed gently on the areola with his teeth. Seconds later she exploded with a sound that was neither a scream nor a grunt. It was something in between, a sound from her uncontrolled voice as the air rushed out of her. He held her as she shook with the spasms of her orgasm and finally went still. He released his lips and rolled away a little to let her breathe. Slowly and gently he slid his thumb from her hot red cunt and took it to his mouth to drink her climactic juices. She was spent. Or so he thought. He gently closed her legs and drew the covers over her. She lay motionless as he stroked her brow and gently wiped the hair from her face. He bent to her and kissed her lips, as a lover, not as a brother. She responded to his kiss with her own and the two stayed there, lips locked to each other, for a considerable time. When they finally broke, Ben rolled to his back with his arms behind his head. Dawn moved toward him and scaled his young slender body. She lay, straddling him with her head on his chest, listening to his now steady heartbeat. He brought his arms down and gently rubbed her back with both hands. She moved a little to press her body closer to his. If she could have melted into him, she would have. He felt her legs crouched each side of him and his thoughts turned to the spread-wide pussy just inches from his half-hard cock. The thought of breaking from this embrace to don a condom was considered and quickly dismissed. He resolved to be responsible next time, but the first time he was to fuck his kid sister was special for both of them. He moved his hands down to caress her tight ass. He rubbed both sides in unison, moving occasionally to her thighs and back. She gave a sleepy sigh and raised her head just enough to kiss his chest before dropping back down. Gradually his cock rose to meet her waiting pussy. As it grew it touched the outside of her flaps and slid up to rest in the crack of her ass. He was completely rigid. Ben started to make almost imperceptible movements of his hips. His cock barely moved along the crack, but as it did the juice oozing from it moved down and flowed between her swollen flaps. The young virgin lay there, waiting for what was to come. Ben stretched the skin on her ass away from the crack and Dawn's flaps popped open revealing the mouth of her delicious little cunt. In a single motion he pulled his hips down, positioning the head of his cock directly over her hole. He hovered for a moment then pushed inside. The tiny body that had been resting limply on top of him suddenly tensed but didn't utter a sound. He continued sliding his rigid cock into her until his body was flat again. They lay there, locked together, for many minutes. Ben could feel her slowly melting again as her cunt became used to the object inside. He tensed his stomach and pushed it a little deeper. As he relaxed again he could feel his juice flowing into her. He raised his knees and readied himself to thrust into her. "Hang on," is all he said as he pressed his cock deep within her. He could feel the tight ring of her cunt around the base of his cock and knew he was home. He relaxed a little and thrust again. He gradually increased his pace until he was thrusting into her hard and fast. Though out this Dawn had not uttered a peep, she tensed more as Ben's thrusts intensified. When her brother slowed for a breather, Dawn used the moment to slide her body further down his. She wanted him deeper. Ben felt her movement and understood. He moved his arms to hold her shoulders tightly against his chest, drew back and rammed his shaft deep into her waiting cunt. That time she moaned a little and he knew she was satisfied. Time and again he rammed into her and he could hear her breathing quicken. He was holding back his cum as best he could, trying to give Dawn the best fuck he could manage. When he heard her breathing change to quick pants, he knew she was an orgasm and he let go. He moved one hand to her ass to stop her rhythm and held her tight as his seed gushed into her. Their bodies had stopped, but they could both feel his cock still pumping more cum into her, and her cunt milking it from him. They both slumped, exhausted,